Welcome to today's explainer on the overlearning brain. You know, for decades, functional neurological disorder, or FND, was brushed off with this incredibly stigmatizing phrase, it's all in your head. Well, today, we're diving into some groundbreaking research that absolutely shatters that myth, proving FND is a very real, physical, biological rewiring of the brain.
So think about this for a second. What happens when your brain learns an injury? Maybe a little too well. We usually think of learning as a purely positive thing, right? Like picking up a new language or learning to ride a bike. But the brain can also learn physical states, things like pain or limp, specifically to protect you after a physical trigger, like a minor injury or even a severe panic attack. But what if the brain gets physically stuck in that protective alarm loop long after the initial threat is actually gone? Well, that is the biological reality of FND. Now, in the past, FND was often treated as just a software glitch. It was kind of like taking your laptop to IT and being told, oh, the code is just acting up. But Dr. Ioannis Mavroudis and his team argue that this old model completely misses the mark. It's not a software bug at all. It's a physically rewired motherboard. Enter the new model, maladaptive overlearning. They've found that severe, chronic stress actually changes the physical hardware of the brain, completely biasing how it learns.
To really grasp this, let's think of the brain as a canvas. We all have this amazing, almost miraculous ability called neuroplasticity. Basically, the brain's capacity to adapt, change, and paint new pathways based on our life experiences. But chronic stress, especially early in life, acts as a literal biological primer on that canvas. It makes the neuroplastic paint highly sensitive and hyperreactive. So the really crucial point here is that a brain with FND isn't broken. Actually, scratch that. It's more like it's entirely too adaptable. It's so primed by stress that when a minor physical trigger happens later in life, the brain instantly overlearns that abnormal state and just locks onto it. And this biological rewiring, it doesn't just happen overnight. It builds chronologically. You see, it almost never starts with the physical symptom itself. It actually starts way back in early life, where childhood stress or adversity enters the picture. This chronic stress acts as that biological primer we just talked about, which leads directly to development phase where the brain becomes hyperplastic, basically way too ready to mold and react. Then, maybe years or even decades later in adulthood, a seemingly innocent physical trigger occurs. But because the brain was primed all those years ago, it immediately overencodes this new physical state. And that brings us right to the present, a rigid physical symptom loop, like functional paralysis or non-epileptic seizures.
So you're probably wondering, where exactly is this hardware change happening? Well, Dr. Mavroudis' research points directly to three interconnected brain networks that get structurally remodeled by chronic stress. Think of these as the three main characters in our story today. First, we have the limbic network, which handles threat detection. Second, the sensorimotor circuits, which control our physical movement. And third, the default mode network, which actually gives us our sense of self. Now, in a healthy brain, these work in total, balanced harmony. But let's look at how that stress primer warps each and every one of them.
First up is the threat hub. This is the brain's emotional alarm system, and it includes areas like the amygdala and the insula. Early trauma essentially induces a persistent hyperreactivity here. The brain's threat detection center becomes permanently biased, getting absolutely trapped on high alert. And simultaneously, this stress warps the areas responsible for the brain's internal map of your bodily sensations. Because the alarm bells are constantly ringing at deafening volumes, the brain begins drastically overweighting and magnifying entirely harmless bodily inputs.
From there, the signal moves to the motor bridge. Normally, your emotional alarm system and your brain's motor control center are kept in completely separate compartments. They don't really mix, but in a stress-primed brain, these totally aberrant connections form. Emotional circuits build a bridge to literally, physically override your movement, specifically the supplementary motor area. Imagine if your car's check engine light was suddenly hardwired directly to your steering wheel, violently yanking it every time the light flickered. That cross-wiring is the direct biological mechanism that results in functional paralysis, gait disorders, or psychogenic seizures.
Have you ever wondered how your brain actually knows that you moved your arm and not someone else? Well, that brings us to the self-agency hub. The brain has a specific region, the temporoparietal junction, that acts exactly like a signature on a check. It confirms whether a physical movement was generated by you or by an outside force. But stress-related alterations completely destabilize this network. When the brain generates a functional tremor, this destabilized hub fails to send that crucial signature of self-agency. And this is exactly why a patient genuinely experiences their own physical symptoms as entirely involuntary. The brain literally hides the origin of the movement from conscious awareness. But hold on, because this rewiring goes even deeper than brain networks. It literally goes all the way down to your DNA. The researchers highlight the incredible role of epigenetics here. Think of it like this. If your DNA sequence is the sheet music, epigenetics are the volume knobs that determine how loudly or softly certain genes are played. Early life adversity leaves an enduring physical signature on your genome by turning these volume knobs, entirely changing how genes are expressed, without actually mutating the underlying DNA itself. And stress turns one very specific knob that profoundly impacts FND. The study points out a massive eureka moment in the research. Dr. Mavrodis and his team note that trauma exposure is, and I quote, associated with heightened amygdala reactivity, increased oxytocin receptor gene methylation in FND. So what does this actually mean? It means trauma exposure doesn't just make the brain's alarm system jumpy. It physically leaves a chemical tag, that methylation, on the gene responsible for oxytocin receptors. We are talking about a measurable, microscopic footprint left directly on the genome by early life trauma. This fundamentally changes the conversation, guys. FND isn't a personality flaw or a weakness. It is a documented biological lock placed on your DNA's ability to process calm and safety. Let's break down why that oxytocin footprint matters so much. We call this the missing safety signal. Now, oxytocin is famously known as the bonding hormone, but its real day job is providing emotional safety and calming down your body's stress response. Because that epigenetic volume knob has been turned down by early trauma, the body downregulates its ability to process oxytocin. It is literally stripping the brain of its natural emotional buffering system. Without enough oxytocin processing, the individual is trapped in a molecular state of high physiological vulnerability. And this brings us to a really crucial piece of the puzzle, the gender disparity in FND, which we know disproportionately affects women. For entirely too long, medicine relied on outdated, frankly offensive psychological stereotypes, like hysteria, to explain this away. But the science moves us way past that, directly into sex-specific biology. Think of female gonadal hormones, like estrogen and progesterone, as a sort of biological multiplier for neuroplasticity. At baseline, they regulate cycles, sure, but they also make the brain incredibly efficient at learning and adapting. But when a chronically stressed HPA axis, your body's stress command system, enters the chat, it completely cross-contaminates this usually helpful learning dynamic. So when female hormones, which remember naturally boost the brain's ability to learn and rewire, collide with a chronically stressed immune command center, it creates a perfect storm of hormonal interplay. The hormones are just trying to help the brain learn quickly, but the stress system is constantly feeding it chaotic, high-alert signals. This specific hormonal background biologically predisposes women to rigidly over-encoding abnormal bodily predictions. The brain is quite literally primed to lock onto symptoms faster and hold onto them much, much tighter. All right, so let's pull this all together. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that FND is the result of a chain of biological vulnerabilities. First, we have structural network alterations in the brain's hardware. Then, this is reinforced by those epigenetic locks on the oxytocin system, depriving the brain of a much-needed safety signal. This all results in an intensely hyperreactive state of neuroplasticity. Ultimately, a trigger causes an overlearned bodily prediction to get locked in. So trauma doesn't directly cause a tremor or a seizure decades later. Instead, it sets the stage, creating a highly sensitive biological environment where a later trigger is drastically misread by the brain. Which brings us to our final, and frankly, most provocative thought of this explainer. If these disabling symptoms are learned by a highly plastic brain, could the right therapies help the brain actually unlearn them? The real beauty of the maladaptive overlearning model isn't just that it validates the patient's biological reality. It highlights that neuroplasticity is a two-way street. If the brain can wire this loop, targeted therapies, whether they're physical, psychological, or neurological, can help rewire it. The hardware isn't broken, it just needs a new set of instructions. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I really hope this leaves you as fascinated and as hopeful about the